Reef Keepers, we've made our way to another beautiful system. I'm sitting here with Al. Al, thank you so much for having me over. I am really excited to get into this tank. As you guys can see, it is a big system. We've got a lot to talk about, but first, Al, let's talk a little bit about how you got into the hobby originally. How did you get into saltwater fish keeping? And how are we now sitting in front of this beautiful tank?
Well, I've been in the hobby for over 30 years. I started when I was 10, I'm kidding. But actually a guy in an apartment complex moved out of his place and he left the tank behind, and so I scooped it up and I started with a 29-gallon under gravel filter, and that's got me, I got bit by the hobby. And my wife and I, several years later, got married, and she got into the hobby as well, and we've been in the hobby ever since. And so we've grown from that 29-gallon tank to a 75, then to a 110. And then before this tank, we had a 220 for many, many years. And of course, this tank here, Pride and Joy, is a 385. It measures 30 inches deep, 90 inches long, 34 inches high, custom built by Derek with Top Shelf. And he also built a stand for me and everything to specifications. So I was so thrilled about him being able to do that for us.
It's gotten to the point now where every time we walk into a space, I can almost tell when I see Derek's work, right? I've seen this tank, I immediately knew it was his work. Let's talk about how old the tank is now. How long has this been tank running since the 220 was shut down?
Yeah, this has been in place since July 21. So it's coming up from 4 years old now.
And then obviously we're kind of looking at a mixed reef, right? We've got soft corals, SPS, LPS. Was the mixed reef the goal from the start? Did you want to kind of focus more on SPS, or was it just kind of as the tank and the reef progressed, is it kind of just turned into what it is today?
Yeah, I really love the different specimens, all the different varietals. Like you mentioned, the soft corals have unique characteristics. I also love some of this stuff, the starburst and stuff you see kind of more common, but again, that's a great nitrate sink. And some of the other corals like the LPS and whatnot, you don't see a lot of those in the hobby, and I just really love having large specimens of those, which is a testimony to good reef keeping, obviously.
We talked a little bit about off camera, about how sometimes you don't see these tanks with gigantic colonies, right? There's a lot of fragging that occurs throughout every single day in reef keeping. People are constantly chopping down their corals. This tank is a great testament of what you guys kind of want to try and do when you're getting these full colonies to grow out. So kind of looking at a lot of them, are these some of the corals from your older systems? Have they moved over to this tank now? How long did it take for people that are watching to get to this point where you have these massive colonies now?
Yeah, great question. I know, so many of the SPS corals are relatively new. They came in shortly after we put this particular tank up. The larger pieces, like the large pagoda here, I know it's kind of hard probably to see the scale of that, but I would just say it's 20 inches in diameter, something like that. I've had that for probably 15 years or so, and it's done very, very well. Some of the other pieces, like the hammer in the center there, that is also about the same age as well. And of course, I've fragged over the years pieces off of that. The leather coral, that's really cool history on that one, because I've had that leather, or at least that particular species, in my aquarium, not the particular piece, but probably over 20 years. And what I do basically is I'm pretty astute at fragging those. And what I basically do is I'll have one grow out very large. That one's probably what I would call medium size. The last one I sold was twice that size in diameter. But what I can do is, as you can see on the camera there, is you can see another smaller one behind it. So I always try to have a couple in the growth mode, where the big one eventually gets too big and I have to sell it. And then I have some of them coming behind it. And I just make sure I'm constantly fragging those. So it's been, again, I've had one in my tank for a very long time, and I think that particular species, having kind of a purple base with the green polyps, is a really unique color.
Yeah, keeping them in rotation, right? You're kind of swapping them in and out. Curious to hear, we talked a little bit about off camera too, coral warfare, right? You've got a lot of different species in here. Is that something that you're dealing with, and how are you dealing with it inside the system? Are you utilizing carbon? Are you utilizing anything in general to try and mitigate this coral warfare? Or is it kind of just welcome to the jungle?
Well, it's welcome to the jungle. And then when I do start having an issue, you can usually, because every day you're looking at a tank, and I usually watch the corals very, very closely. And if I start seeing some stress on a particular coral, I do it again to mitigate that stress. And to your point, which is great, we can always add carbon. I know polyfilter is one of my favorites to use. That pulls out a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll change the water movement a little bit to kind of help with because a lot of like the Copophilia boulder down there, it sends out stinger tentacles at night, and so I can change the current a little bit to try to keep it from stinging other corals. But I know one of the key things to your point, and a lot of people don't realize, is these corals, they do give off chemicals. And the chemicals get into the water column, and it's very important that you address those chemicals in the water column itself. And because even though they may not touch each other, they may kill each other even with that chemical warfare.
The fish in the tank are beautiful. I've been watching them the whole time I've been in here too, and it's really cool to see some of the smaller fish you have mixed in here as well. The 6 line, saw a Blaine up top. Let's talk about some of the fish you have.
Yeah, what's fun with this larger tank, I've got the Rologrammas. I've always liked those, and they're kind of just, everybody seems to have one of those, but we got a school of those in here. Oh, wow. Which is really cool.
Very unique. Most people talk about it, how you can only keep one, but you've got a school.
Yeah, yes. And I love the way they school together, and actually they get along fine. I think in a larger tank like this, it must be conducive for them, but I'll actually see them. So right now you can't see them. We're in the back over here. I kind of see 1 or 2 of them, but they will come out, I guess, the lighting. But when I go to feed them, you'll see them come out in a group, which is kind of fun to watch. And they'll do a little pecking sometimes, and then of course, like you mentioned, some of the other fish. One of my favorite fish in there is underneath the boulder brain over there is some engineer gobies. They're fun because when they're small, they have horizontal stripes, and as they get larger, and of course those are about that long now, the stripe pattern changes, and they're great for keeping the gravel stirred up and not stagnant.
Do you have any issue with them moving any of the corals or the boulders around? I know sometimes people talk about how once they get to that bigger size, they really can start shifting the scape. Obviously the scape's pretty big and grown in, but are they moving things around as well?
Well, it's a great point, and I think new hobbyists need to know that, but since I love engineer gobies so much, I made sure we put the rock in before the gravel.
Gotcha.
So all the big pieces are placed in. Of course, they may undermine my coral, like in the gravel, like that from time to time. But underneath the brain coral, I actually have a piece of PVC like that to kind of keep it propped up a little bit, and that gives room for the engineer goby to play under there. And they're fun because they'll move around underneath the whole complex under here.
Obviously, you have some fish that are for viewing, right? You have the angel, you've got some cardinal fish, the royal grammas, but I see a ton of working fish too, right? You've got a great group of tangs. I saw the 6 line wrasse. Any other kind of working fish you have in this system?
Well, all the tangs, they obviously are grazing all day long. I love having a bristle tooth. I also love having like the traditional tangs, like the yellow and the purple tang that pick all the time. The lieutenant tang is one of our favorites. Beautiful color, but he'll graze. As far as other maintenance, we have a jawfish in there to kind of help sift the gravel.
What are you feeding these guys? What are they getting for feeding on a daily basis?
So I try to mix it up. So we'll do frozen food about a couple times a week. Typically, if I'm in a hurry, I'll just put some pellets in there. It's so funny because they know the time of day, and if my wife and I walk in here, they'll gather on this end of the tank, and if we go over there, they'll gather on that end of the tank. It's kind of fun to watch, and then we'll just feed them, into the top of the tank. I also have an automatic feeder on the sump, and that helps a lot with the fish during the day when I'm at work. So, fish in nature, they eat several times a day, obviously, all day long. And so I just drop a little bit of feed into the sump, and the pump pulls it in and blows it in here. And it's quite funny because the fish actually know about what time it gets fed.
What are you feeding out of the auto feeder?
Pellets.
Pellets, okay. TDO pellets, is that what you're feeding in there?
Yes.
Gotcha. And then for the cleanup crew, curious to hear about your cleanup crew too. I saw some snails, looks like some conchs in the sand bed too. What did you end up deciding for this system?
Well, that's all the ones you mentioned. And then also, I really am a big proponent of the Sally Lightfoot crabs. The Sally Lightfoot crabs, we have, I believe, 3 very large Sally Lightfoot crabs are about 4 inches, I guess, or so from end to end with their legs. They graze all day long. Now, I'm a big proponent of getting all females because the males typically have a tendency to dominate or territorial, but the females seem to get along pretty well. And I've had these Sally Lightfoot crab probably over 10 years.
A lot of the specimens inside the tank, I keep hearing it, are older, right? So some of the tangs you were saying are almost 20 years old as well.
Yes.
And then the equipment, let's get into some of the equipment we've got in the tank. I see you've kept it to a minimal, right, of all the equipment inside the system. Big fan of that. I love not seeing a bunch of wires, keeping a bunch of clunky equipment on the inside. Let's talk about some of the equipment. Obviously, we'll show off the sump space, and we can talk about that here in a second. But let's talk about some of the equipment here in the system and the lighting up top.
Basically, we have 4 of the Ecotech lights across the top. Basically, it seems to be doing really well, and I have them cranked up to about 60% on high. And that's pretty much all I have for the lighting up top. And then down below, we have a calcium reactor.
And it is a big calcium reactor. That is not some toy calcium reactor. We're talking about a big calcium reactor.
Well, it's a big tank.
Right, exactly.
And I was burning through the additives so fast, I had to find an alternative solution. So I have the main reaction chamber in the rear, and then up front, I have a magnesium chamber, which takes the effluent from the calcium reactor through the magnesium, which helps. I do not dose CO2 in that. Obviously, it helps take some of the CO2 out of suspension. And then when I have the discharge from that going into, and I have it drop actually into the protein skimmer so that it helps blow off the gas.
Gotcha. And then running 2 MP60s, it looks like, in the tank?
Correct.
What are you doing for the flow pattern on those?
Those I have it, for during the day, I have kind of a somewhat of a variation, but I have it on a lower setting because some of these corals during the day, since they're out full, kind of get damaged if it's blowing too hard. So the new pumps do in the evenings as the lights start to turn down, the pumps change their pattern, and I have them kick up overnight to remove detritus in the nighttime hours when most of the coral are closed up.
I feel like that's something I've talked about in a couple videos recently, is the idea that as our tanks are kind of growing out, right? They're changing, they're ever evolving, and the corals too, they're kind of disrupting the pattern of the flow. Have you seen that as this tank has evolved, you had to change the flow at all or anything like that? I mean, obviously with the giant pagoda, the Slimer, all these gigantic colonies, interesting to hear whether or not you have to deal with maybe some dead spots or particular areas you have to try and refocus some flow to.
Yeah, I've been having to move these pumps, from left to right a little bit, up and down, just to try to get the right flow. To your point, I know like the coral, this coral here, you can see some little white specks in there. That's the gravel from the bottom, and the fish, when they're playing or eating whatever else, they'll drop it in there. Sometimes the water patterns can kind of help clear it, sometimes not. But to your point, I want to make sure that all the corals have a good exchange of gas and making sure there's a good water flow over them, but not too strong.
And then no sump underneath, as we just showed off. You've got the reactor down below. The sump is actually over in the other room. Let's talk a little bit about the sump. So you've got the sump in a closet. You originally texted me, you said, I've got the sump in a closet. And sure enough, I walked in here and the sump was actually in the closet. Let's talk about that setup and how you decided to get that away from the tank originally.
Yeah, being in a hobby so long, I'm like, climbing underneath the tank and having to do all my maintenance under there. And then, of course, one of the key things, too, was a big deterrent or determining factor was the fact that if you listen, it's very, very quiet. This is the quietest tank I've ever had. I mean, it is absolutely silent.
Silent. I think the only thing you can even hear is the radio fans. So that's like the only thing you can even maybe hear a whisper of.
So when you're sitting here, I don't want to be hearing all of the other stuff. So when we moved it to the back, which is a small linen closet in the back, that eliminated all that noise, which is huge. And of course, a lot easier for me to work on back there than having to climb under the tank to work on it.
Keeping some old school methods too as well in your sump, right? You've got the filter socks. Still going with filter socks? Are you a big fan of those still?
I am. So twice a month I clean those out. The mesh socks I change every 2 weeks. The one with the 500 micron, I rinse them out and change it once a month.
You've got a nice big skimmer. I'm sure you're trying to pull quite a bit of nutrients out of the tank, right? I'm sure with a good amount of fish, but also the corals are doing a lot of that work too. I'm sure, like you said, being a good nutrient sink. And you're also running a Refugium space. I think that's something that a lot of people have started to stray away from in the hobby. They felt like maybe it wasn't doing the right thing. Let's talk a little bit about the Refugium, why you went with that.
I think that's absolutely huge in the hobby. Like you said, getting back to basics, Martin Moe is one of the books I absolutely just worshipped for many decades. Because it was simplistic, right? Getting back to underground filter, you got to understand the processes there. The socks gets mechanical filtration, and then the protein skimmer helps scrub the water. And then, of course, you have all these nutrients in the water itself that those two elements will not pull out. The Refugium you got to make sure I run it off cycle. So the lights come on when these lights go off. And that helps with the pH in the aquarium. And that Chetomorphia that I have back there grows like a weed. And I have to harvest, and in that Refugium back there, it's about a 60-gallon Refugium. And I harvest about and I'm serious, a 5-gallon bucket, but it's jammed with a keto about every 4 weeks. I have to pull that out. And that's removing those elements from the water that you don't want to back up into the water. It kind of helps me with keeping the water, clearer. I do a water change every 6 to 8 weeks. And in this size tank, I do about 90 gallons every 6 to 8 weeks.
You touched on something I was going to ask you, maintenance. So you're doing the water change, right? You're doing that water change every 6 to 8 weeks. What are we also doing for dosing? I saw also back there, we saw a Trident. Let's talk a little bit about that too. Obviously, the hobby has grown so much in the 30 years you've been in the hobby. Me, about 10 years less, about 20 years in the hobby. I've seen the hobby completely shift.
Right.
Let's talk about how you're still incorporating the old school methods, but now reintroducing that nice new technology.
Well, I love the Apex and the Trident. The Trident, I do calibrate that myself periodically. Every few weeks, I will just do a HANA test kit to make sure that it's still in line. And sometimes I'll go into the system and have to calibrate and change the values to recalibrate it to the HANA test kit. And then I really like the fact that I can monitor from afar, from on vacation or something. I can check the pH, I can check the temperature. And if I have an issue, I can call a friend and say, hey, can you go check on the tank for me? 10 years ago, you couldn't do that, But now I could actually do that. And I think that's great. You were talking about dosing before, so I also use the Apex for dosing. I do the major elements when the calcium reactor, so the calcium reactor pretty much takes care of 90% of it. But if I need to boost alkalinity or I need to boost calcium or magnesium, I'll kick on the dosers for that. And I like the way I can program those. It's very specifically, and I run those typically, slowly during the course of the day, not dump it all at once.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've definitely hit it right on the nail, kind of focusing on those major elements, right? Mm-hmm. Any other elements that you're kind of seeing you're trying to go after too? Any other extra dosing? I've seen a ton of people running the Reef Moonshiners method lately. That's been something I've seen a lot more. And I'll be honest, I'm a little overwhelmed with the sheer amount of bottles and elements that they're dosing. Nice to hear that you're running this beautiful tank, this system that's been up and running and growing corals extremely well for 4 years, and you're pretty much keeping just to the main elements. What are the parameters you're shooting for? What are the numbers we're looking at?
Well, let me back up to what you were talking about a minute ago. So about a year into this new tank, because when you get a new tank, you got new rock going in, you got stuff going in. About a year in, I noticed that some of the corals were starting to go a little stagnant. I mean, the coloring just wasn't there. After doing some research and talking to some friends, I said, I need my minor elements. And so I sent a water sample off to an ICP test company, and I had them take a look at it, and I was like, oh my gosh, the strontium and the potassium, and these corals were sucking it all out. So I added another doser, and I started adding the Red Sea trace elements. So all those trace elements, I also add the bioactive part of the trace elements. So I get them from the store. I just buy the half liter, and then I have it regulated, so it's giving it a couple of mils per day per actual ingredient itself. And then you're asking me about what I'm shooting for. So my alkalinity, I usually run it, I try to shoot about 9.5 my alkalinity, MEQ. The pH naturally seems to fall. If I run the alkalinity properly, the pH will typically hover 8.1, 8.3, depending on the time of day. Magnesium, I'm running about 1,300 to 1,400, and calcium right now is about 475.
And then what are you going for the phosphates? Do you have a specific number for your phosphates at all, or you just kind of let it do its thing?
Phosphates are tricky. If you have too much phosphate, you start getting hair algae everywhere. The Refugium really helps keep my phosphates down. Typically, when you test for phosphates, I pretty much get trace of phosphates. But I do you need to have some in the aquarium to help feed the corals, and I know you get some of that injection through the food that we give the fish itself.
Funny, for the longest time in the hobby, phosphates were like these secret killers that everybody wanted to get rid of, and it seems like there's now been this new discovery, not super new, but just people wanting to have a higher level of phosphates. The scape itself, did you make this scape yourself, or was this created by someone?
Well, actually, when when we got the tank all set up, one of the guys from the shop, he was, I guess his stature was maybe about 5 foot tall or something like that. We talked about getting in the aquarium, and then I handing him the rock into the aquarium, which was kind of fun. And he was in, I got pictures of him in the tank, but we would lift the rock up and over. And then we wanted to create some, my wife really liked having like large arches and stuff like that for the fish to go through. So we were able to successfully do that. And that was great because him being able to walk in there made it a lot easier for us.
For sure. I feel like that's a great testament of how truly big these systems are, right? If you can get inside of your tank, that's a big fish tank. That is more than a big fish tank. So you had the 220 before, you shut it down. Now, where did everything go in the 220 before we ended up getting this tank set up? Because you said the sump was actually the first thing you made before this tank was even brought into the home. Where did everything live, the fish and all the corals that were still around? Where were they hanging out during that time period?
Well, it's funny you ask, because we had a 220 in the same spot, and obviously this is much bigger. I had to socialize this and convince my wife to commandeer one of our bedrooms so I could set up what we call a trash can reef. It's one of those Rubbermaid, I had Rubbermaid cans, 32-gallon Rubbermaid food grade cans, and then also the big trough feeders. And then I had those plumbed together. And to your point, I had the sump built in advance. So about a year prior to me getting this new tank.
Oh, wow.
I had designed a new sump, and somebody, a guy at Top Shelf, one of the guys that works for you guys, I had him build that sump for me and got it all operating on the 220, and then I was able to utilize that for the trash can reef. And so all the corals, all the fish were in that trash can reef for I guess it was about 4 months, because when we switched this tank out, it was during COVID. And so we had some delays.
Of course.
And then when, of course, they came through, and actually, Derek did a great job. He was actually about a month ahead of schedule once he was able to get the components he needed. And so then we got everything in here, and then it was a matter of a couple of days to get everything moved over.
And then the other thing too, I laugh and think to myself, you said the tank was about 4 years old. In reality, it's almost 5, kind of in a way, because you were transitioning that tank from the trash can reef, I love the name of that, from the trash can reef to now the 380 that we're seeing here today. So it's almost like that period before was kind of allowing you to really kind of cycle in a way that sump space and get it rolling. Did you also see that the transition from the 220 that had been broken down into this new big reef? How was that transition period for the, that cycle period? I guess there was no real cycle period, right? Or did you see that there was some cycling that was kind of occurring?
Yeah, there was some, and I know just being in the hobby for a very long time, you want to be very sensitive to that.
Right.
The trash can reef it was probably about 600 gallons of water when it was all set up. Again, that was primarily to make sure I was able to cycle everything, and that was running for a while. But because I know a lot of the reef rock in here is at Carib Sea, so the big arches. We put those in there, and obviously those need to cycle. I know they said they have bacteria embedded in them, but I wanted to give them a chance to cycle. And so I watched my ammonia levels, my nitrate levels very closely for a few weeks, but it actually transitioned very quickly.
What would be something, if you're looking at this tank, the grass is always greener, right? People will tend to look at their systems and be like, man, I wish I changed this. Man, I wish I went with this. Is there anything in particular with this system that you wish you would have went with, started with, or done at the beginning of it starting? Or are you happy with where it's at today?
Having so many years in the hobby, I really try to engineer in all the things I could possibly engineer in. Like the overflow in the back. One of the things that Derek did for me is I didn't want to have a box back there. So it's an angle, and it comes forward and it goes back. And I wanted to make sure it was long enough that I wouldn't have a big waterfall back there. And that's what helps contribute to that quietness of the overflow itself. So I'm very happy to have that designed in there. As far as other things, maybe a little bigger tank. No, I'm kidding. But that was, I think, having Starfire glass is a real huge plus. Real crystal clear water, viewing for the aquarium itself. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head.
You said it earlier too with the Starfire, right? Is that you got to be careful with it, working on it, right? But it is truly crystal clear. It's really awesome. I mean, originally I've seen some tanks that run ozone, and it makes the fish seem like they're almost floating in the water. It's very similar to what I'm seeing here. The tank is super crystal clear. The water's really clear too. I see random flow generators on your nozzles. Do you like having the random flow generators on there? Is that something you're taking off frequently and cleaning? I'm always curious to kind of hear from people with their random flow generators.
Transparently, I don't think I've cleaned them. They've been on there for about 4 years. But I do like the random flow because if you have a direct flow, it's going to have obviously damage coral. But having that actual, it's those were actually built by, they built them through a 3D printer. And it pulls in extra water from back, and so it creates more of a water flow. So it's not just a pump, it actually creates an additional water flow. So I do like those a lot, and again, it gives it more indirect flow.
And then the return pumps over there, what are we running for return pumps?
Return pumps are the Vortex L2s.
And then is it 2 returns for this system?
Correct.
Gotcha.
2.
We talked about it off camera as well, the redundancy of, power outages. Let's talk about that, right?
Okay.
When these tanks kind of go down, a lot of people start scrambling, right? Grabbing bubblers, grabbing things here and there. When you have a system of this sheer size, right? There's a lot of animals, obviously, depending on you to get the tank back up and running. You have a lot of great redundancy in here to make sure this tank keeps rolling. Let's talk about some of that redundancy.
Okay, well, I'm originally from New Orleans, and I went to help my friends after Katrina, and I got to see a lot of dead tanks, and I did not want that to happen here. Thankfully, when we lose power, it's only for a couple of days. So I try to plan for that, but of course, longer is even better. We do have a generator in the house that, for the refrigerator and the air conditioning, things like that, which is great. But I also have solar in the back. It's a small system, just a couple of panels with a couple of car batteries, and that obviously drives a 12-volt line. And I'm able to use that 12-volt line to plug into one of the L2s, for example, just to keep some water movement. And then underneath the aquarium here, I also have a couple of trickle chargers working with a couple of and if you're in the house, you can't put a regular car battery.
Right.
It has to be a completely sealed battery, and these are lithium-ion batteries. They're a little bit more expensive, but I have them mounted down there with a trickle charger on them, and they're hooked up to my 60s, MP60s. And so, again, if the power goes out, at least you want water flow. It doesn't have to be a whole lot, but you have to have some water flow to keep the oxygen and stuff like that in the water, because that's what happened after the hurricane and Katrina, the tanks, they were stagnant. And that's why they lost all their corals.
Right. I tell people too, even if they don't have anything, grab a pitcher from your kitchen or a big glass and just start pouring water in and out. Try to get that water moving around. Right. I don't think I asked you earlier, coral food. Are we adding any coral food, or are we just allowing kind of the natural numbers, the fish poop, any liquid food you're feeding them?
I use some of that Red Sea. I have to show you the bottle, but it's like an AB, part AB or something, and I put a little bit in there.
AB plus, is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah.
And then I ask every single person when I come in, I think it's the most important question I ask in all of these interviews is Jake Adams, someone that I always watched every single day growing up, looking at reef builders and kind of trying to learn from him. And he would always ask people, what is one tip you'd give someone if they're getting into the hobby, or any reef keeper? So I'm gonna ask you as well. If you were talking to someone that wanted to get into the hobby, what would your tip be? I said it to you off camera, but you would be a person I would want to listen to, right? I mean, look at the system. It's truly beautiful. You guys have done an amazing job creating a piece of the ocean in your living room. So what would one of those tips be?
If you're starting in the hobby, don't expect to get this. It's something you have to work towards. Like I mentioned earlier, I started with underground filter, and it worked fine. I had sponges in there, I had fish in there, I had other, invertebrates and things like that. It's a great place to start, and you want to learn. I would really recommend people understand the science behind this. I mean, this is I would say it's more of a chemistry, really. I mean, when you see the sump in the back, you'll see over the top of it, I have powdered elements, all the different salts that go in this. I try to make sure I monitor all the stuff and I add as I need to. Get to know the science. Like the Martin Moe book I mentioned earlier, it's about yay thick, but it was a great read to understand all the components of what's happening in the actual ocean itself and how we try to replicate that here. Right,
always trying to just replicate the ocean. I mean, we talked about it with the farm manager a couple days ago. Corey, we were talking about the sheer fact of just the chemistry, right? There is so much chemistry that goes into it. You were talking about ICPs, right? You're gonna see, it's almost overwhelming, the sheer amount of elements you're seeing, and you don't even realize that's something that these fish and these corals all actually need in the end. But Al, I want to say thank you again. This has
welcome.
been really amazing. If you guys have tuned in throughout the course of this episode, it has been a ton of fun. I can't wait for this to get shown off on the channel. I want to say thank you to Al. Thank you to his wife for allowing us into his home, but this has been a great time. If you guys have hung out all the way till the end, I want to say thank you very much. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you don't miss out on any future uploads.